So we transferred to the hospital. This is part 3 of my birth story. We get there, and because I had this premonition I was going to be transferred anyway, um, about, I want to say 4 or 5 months into my pregnancy, I had scheduled a tour of the hospital. So I had already toured it. And while I was there on the tour, I asked for all the paperwork. I said, I need all of the admission paperwork. And I filled it out in advance because of this premonition that, hey, I might be transferred. And like I said in a different, I think 2 videos ago, I am a firm believer in preparation. I like to be prepared. I think it's a responsibility to be prepared, for whatever options you can be. I did not plan for and I did not hope for the transfer, but I knew, okay, let's say worst case scenario, I have to go to the hospital. I do not want to be in a situation where I have to take an hour filling out paperwork in between contractions and while I'm in labor, and knowing that I am striving for a home birth and I am preparing for a home birth. I knew I did not want to be in a situation where if I transferred, it's probably because something is wrong. It's probably because we're like in an emergency. And so I thought, okay, if I transfer from home, it could be bad. And so I want to go ahead and have all of my paperwork signed, filled out. I knew I wanted time to read the fine print and to understand what I was agreeing to. And I'm very glad that I did, because as I was reading it, I didn't want certain things, and I was able to sign waivers so that we didn't have those. So there were things like that where I was like, all right, like I want to go ahead and get this to understand my rights, to understand the process, and what to expect so I can prepare my heart. And that way I'm not preparing my heart and trying to catch my heart up in the moment, especially because for me, the hospital setting brings up so much triggering emotions and taps into some of the deepest trauma of my life. So I did not want to be dealing with those emotions in the middle of an emergency. So we had the paperwork and it was so smooth, man. We just were able to walk in there and hand them everything that they needed. They get us to a room within like 2 minutes. The nurse meets us and she's like, "Hi, I'm Carol. I'm your nurse today. And like, you're my only patient." And she's like, "I'm here just for you." And it was just really cool. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, well, no, get me wrong. Like, I guess I know how to delight in any situation. It's not what I wanted, and I don't want to give that impression, because it really irritates me when people hear, "Oh, I went to the hospital," and their response is, "Well, all that matters is that you had a happy, like a healthy delivery." No, that's not all that matters. Like, there are other things that matter. One thing that matters is not being super triggered in in trauma. One thing that matters is not having so much stress that you are affecting your baby, and that you're, having to do some deep emotional processing in the moment. Like, that matters. Sometimes just as much as some of the other issues pertaining to an emergency. Emotions matter, and heart responses matter, and that is huge. So don't tell me that all that matters is a physically healthy outcome, because that's not the truth. So, I'm reluctant. I think at times I'm tempted to guard my heart by overemphasizing the fact I did not want this, and then hide the fact that I had a great experience. But I'm not going to do that, because I did have a good experience and I faced my fear and I had a great outcome. So we get there. I told the nurse coming into it, I said, "Look, I have a birth plan, I have a doula, I have a midwife. They are my advocates, they are my representatives, they know my history. It's very important to me that they are honored and respected throughout this process. I have medical trauma. They can explain it to you if needed, and I don't want to be here, but I've got a good attitude. I'm gonna make the best of it, and I'm not gonna be a problem for you. Don't be a problem for me. And so that was kind of my pep talk on the front end every time I met a new nurse. So we go through it, they're getting me in, they're giving me the IV, which I really didn't want. And I'm not going to reiterate why. I made another video talking about all the domino effect, interventions that you will get in the hospital. So they couldn't get the IV in. They had to try 2 times. And then they're like, we need someone to come with a sonogram to get your IV put in because your veins are so small. So if I ever do this again and have to transfer and end up in the hospital, I am going to ask on the front end, hey, I need the sonogram girl to come, because she came and got her little thing out and she's like, oh, here's the vein in 2 seconds, and it wasn't a big deal. But the first 2 were not good experiences. Gosh, man, that hurt. I had huge bruises for 2-3 weeks after birth. So no bueno. Get my IV, and they start, that was not me, that was the baby, but they start Pitocin, and I was nervous about that, and I made another video describing Pitocin and how it can contradict with your body's natural contractions. But by this point, I was only having contractions on my own every 20 minutes. So they start the Pitocin, and I didn't think it was that bad. I mean, by this point, I had done labor for almost 3 days. So for me, the Pitocin was not really that bad. It kept me going. And they started at a really low dose. And I was like, I want this gradual. I want a really low, as low as you'll give it. I want to just take it, every hour or 2. We can increase if needed, but don't start me on a high dose. I need to ease in. I need to get used to this. And they honored it. And so they're starting me on this, and the contractions start coming again. I'm bouncing on the birth ball. Now, one thing I predicted, and it was true, was I did not feel I had freedom of my range of motion, because by this point, at home, the way that the baby's head was positioned, and we learned this later, it cut off my urethra. So I could not pee on my own. I had to be catheterized every time I wanted to pee. And the midwives, they have a straight cath, so they don't leave it in. And so every 3 or 4 hours, I was getting catheterized, and we were taking out large quantities of urine, and that would give me some relief. And, I'm drinking so much water throughout this thing. And then whenever we get to the hospital, they gave me a Foley catheter, which is, it stays in. It has a balloon that sits in your bladder and it doesn't come out. And so between the catheter, which really disturbed me, I hate tubes, especially tubes hanging out of my vagina. That was not cool. That was not cool. And so that's going on. It made me feel very uncomfortable to walk around and to sit. I did not like how that felt. I didn't like the weight of it. I didn't like whenever I would move, it wasn't even a tugging, but you could kind of feel the weight of it and I wouldn't even say pulling, but in your urethra. It was a gross feeling. I did not like the IV, and that was very uncomfortable because I didn't feel like I could put as much pressure as I wanted on my arm. I felt like I always was very hyper aware of the movement of my arm because of the tubes with the IV. So that's where my willingness to do different birth positions and really move around and utilize the space went out the window. The other thing was they had this great jacuzzi pool, But what we learned was you can't get the IV wet when you're in the jacuzzi pool. So they'll tape it up in a way, but they're like, you can't submerge it in water. And if I'm in a bathtub, I don't really want to keep my arm out the whole time. I want the freedom to like relax and lean back and lean forward and get on my hands and knees. And I didn't have that freedom, so I didn't even use the tub. They also don't let you deliver in the tub at the hospital. And so the motivation was just, I don't want to get in a tub and be all wet and then get out to push the baby out. Like that sounds miserable to me. So that was a no for me. I did get in the shower briefly. And it was just okay. I'm so used to having my shower at home, and our shower is real nice. So I was super bougie, and whenever I was kind of embarrassed. I think I embarrassed Brandon because they're like, "Oh yeah, you could get in the shower if you prefer." And we'll set up a chair in there and all this. And so I'm sitting there and I'm like, it doesn't have two shower heads. Like, I don't want to be here. So they're like, no, it doesn't have two shower heads. And at the time, the nurse didn't know that the wand could come off. And she's like, no, it's just kind of fixed. You can like position it, the angle of it, but it doesn't come off. And I'm like, what's the point? Like, if you can't use the wand, and then I just like yanked it off and it worked. So I got in the shower for a little bit. We did this for a few hours on the Pitocin. And then they checked me again. I had not progressed at all. And they had upped the Pitocin, I think maybe 2 or 3 doses by this point. And they said, okay, next step is we are going to give you an epidural. And I said, oh, okay. I have several concerns. I do not want to be, and so the gal's coming in to give the epidural, and I'm like, look, and I found in the medical setting, I had my appendix taken out a few years ago, and that was also a very good experience. And I found that when I would just articulate my fears and my concerns, they were either able to answer it or they were able to comfort me in a way that was very helpful. So I laid it all out and I said, look, epidural girl, lady, I am very concerned because I do not want a spinal injury. I've had back problems off and on my whole life. I don't want a spinal injury. I do not want to be one of those people who the epidural will work for like one side of my body and the other side can feel everything. I don't want, to not be able to, like, I'd like to have as much feeling as possible. And, I'm also nervous that when you give me this thing, I don't want to be one of those people who just like completely loses all sensation. Cause that's gonna, be disturbing to me. And she's like, okay, look, if you'll just be very still, she's like, I'm very good at this. If you'll be very still, do not move. That is the best thing that you can do, and lean forward as much as possible. She explained the whole thing and what she was going to do in great detail, which I appreciated. And I was like, okay, I know what to expect. I am going to be as still as possible. And by this point, I had been in labor for 3 days. So I was like, and I'd been catheterized repeatedly. Like by this point, maybe 9 or 10 times. I had gone through those manual turns. So I was like, I can do anything at this point. So I'm like hunched over. Brandon's got me. He's holding both of my arms. And it took her like 3 to 5 minutes. It was no big deal. She numbed me up, put it in, and then they started the medicine. And it was incredible. I'm not gonna lie. It was incredible. I didn't even know I was having contractions after that. So, and then it became a game because we're all watching the monitor, and you're hooked up to a monitor. I started with the mobile, like it's like a Bluetooth enabled fetal monitor. And then they put the one with like the belt on your stomach. after I got the epidural. And they, the, the epidural, golly, man, like night and day difference. And, if you don't want to experience your labor, that is the way to go. I'm going to tell you that right now. Like, oh my gosh. So we're like watching the monitor and watching the contractions, and I could still tell I was having them. Like I was like, oh yeah, I can kind of feel like some tightening. And the other thing about the epidural was I could still move my legs like freely. They felt numb and they felt heavy, but I could move them. Like if I wanted to pull my leg up, or if I wanted to kind of like put my foot up, I was able to do all of that. So I felt like I wasn't just a victim, to lay there and have to exist. During that time, I ate a meal. I know you're not supposed to do that in the hospital, but I ate some snacks. And the idea behind the epidural and the reason that they wanted to give it to me was because they wanted to see if that could relax my body to the point where it would dilate. So that combined with the Pitocin, keeping the contractions going, they were thinking, all right, maybe the epidural will dilate, your body will relax, and then it will, get things going again. So I do this for several hours, and then I get checked, and they're saying, they were like, sorry, nothing has changed. And I said, can I have, like, what's the maximum amount of time you'll give me? Because at this point, I'm just living on prayer. Like, I am just going to pray this baby out. And the doctor's like, well, I mean, like, you have any time? And I was like, well, we want you. Because the doctor that we had on call that day is a very home birth friendly doctor. She is she's one that honors the natural process. She's easy to work with. My midwife gets along with her very well and has had other births with her. So I wanted that doctor, and I was like, what time is your shift over? And she's like, well, I don't want to be starting a C-section at 5 a.m. because her shift was over at 7. And so I was like, well, okay, when would you like to be starting a C-section? Because we want to honor your time. I recognize that there's little we can do at this point. So what's the latest you'll give us? And she's like, anytime before 5 a.m. And I said, okay, how about we make the call at, 1 a.m. or 12 a.m. It was something like that. She's like, deal. And I also wanted the baby to come on May 4th so that we could say, may the 4th be with you. And that was a joke I had for like 2 or 3 weeks by this point. And so I was like, we're just a few hours from midnight. Could we just wait until after midnight? And she's like, yeah, that's fine. So we wait. The time comes, anesthesiologist comes, and then they get me ready for surgery. And just as they were doing that, they noticed I had started to bleed a lot, and our heart rates were still good, but like, my midwife is down there looking, and she's like, Courtney, you're bleeding a lot. And I'm like, like, what do I do? Like, I'm laying there with my epidural, can't really move at this point. They're getting me prepped for surgery. I'm like, I can't help it. What do I do? And she's like, I don't know. Like, maybe this means the baby is coming. Sometimes that happens. And the doctor's like, oh yeah. And they check me again, not dilated. So they're like, get her to surgery. And that was another thing I had a premonition about, and that I had been praying about for several months, was I do not want to bleed out. I do not want a transfusion, especially with all of the COVID stuff. I don't want to receive a transfusion from someone who's had the COVID vaccine. And there's no way that they really regulate that anymore. So like they don't have any control over, is this blood that has the vaccine in it or not. So that was a huge concern. And I had been taking a lot of supplements like alfalfa and spirulina to strengthen my blood, just in case. And I was like diligent about that. And it's something I had spent a lot of prayer in. So I thought that was interesting. They wheel me back to surgery. They're giving me this medicine. I'm getting like a sharp pain in my right arm, that's like shooting down my arm. And I was like, hey, I think that this like medicine is causing me a lot of discomfort. I felt like this huge pressure on my chest, this like weight on my chest, and it was just awful. And that was a moment where I was thinking, this is borderline unbearable. And I was even kind of contemplating, should I ask them to put me to sleep? Because the pressure on my chest every time that they give me a round of this medicine, and they did it like 4 times, the pressure on my chest, the pain in my arm, it's almost unbearable. Like, I don't know how much more of this I can take. And then to have this while I'm in surgery, like, I don't know if I can handle this. So that was one of the things. And I kind of mentioned it to the anesthesiologist, and they were kind of like, oh, we've never heard of that before. But as it turns out, it's pretty common. So I do intend to write a letter and just kind of say something like, hey, consider this. Like, I'd like to, make a note, please, of this. Because my doula, no, it was my doula, I said, hey, like, there's a lot of before they wheeled me out, I was like, there's a lot of pressure on my chest and there's like a pain in my arm. And my doula came over and she pointed right to it and she goes, I bet it's right there. And I said, yes. And she said, I've heard this like from several people that they've experienced similar things. So I think that was just something that I was like, that's weird. So they get me back to surgery. Brandon had to wait outside while they're prepping me. And I'm to the anesthesiologist guy. I'm like, listen, I do not want to be one of those people who gets halfway into this C-section and then I regain my feeling. Like, I don't want to feel a thing. And I'm going to be upset if that happens, like, as if they can do anything about it. And I'm just like, please make sure I can't feel anything. And he's like, all right. So like, they're doing all these like pricks on me. And he's got this sharp, I don't even know what he was using, but I know it was sharp. And he's like pricking my stomach in different places. And like, do you feel 1 or 2, more? I'm like, 2, 1, and I could feel all of them. So I was like, is it working? Like, please. So he waits a little bit. Brandon comes in the room. I'm like listening. I have my phone up by my ear because I asked them, can I just bring my phone? I want to listen to a sermon just in case I meet Jesus. I want to go out listening to him. So I'm like listening to Graham Cook and a prophetic soaking. He does this prophetic where he basically just gives words of encouragement. So I'm listening to this, Brandon sitting by me, and then the anesthesiologist guy goes, Courtney, the doctor has poked you with something very sharp. And he said it like that. And I was like, bah! And I didn't even feel it. And I'm like, she's doing it. She's poking me with sharp things. And he's like, did you feel it? And I had to think for a minute. And in my mind, I'm like, oh no, I can't give the wrong answer. Like, I was just so worried I would give the wrong answer. I was like, no, I did not feel it. And I kind of settled down and regained my composure. And he's like, okay, we're going to start the surgery now. And I'm like, no, fine, do it. No. So there was like a weird array of emotions when that happened. And when they are doing this surgery, you can feel the tugging, you can kind of feel your body moving a little bit, you can feel the cutting and the opening, but it doesn't hurt. So And it didn't really disturb me because I knew to expect that. So it didn't bother me because I had already heard enough about C-sections, and, my sister had had a few of them, and I've asked several friends about their experiences. So it didn't bother me because I knew what to expect. It would have bothered me if I had not known to expect that, though. So, they're doing all this. And it didn't seem like much time. And I think at one point I asked the anesthesiologist assistant gal, I was like, so how much longer, do you think it's going to be? And she said, you're going to have a baby in like 5 minutes. And I can't believe I'm getting emotional now because I didn't get emotional in the moment. But they pull the baby out and I heard her cry. And everyone's celebrating, and I'm not one to react emotionally in the moment. That I'm one like this who catches up later. They hold her up, and I remember being so scared to touch her because her head was so oblong, and it was so like misshapen. And she's covered in a vernix, and she's all like purple and I was just like I wasn't touching her, but I was holding my hand close, and I was just like amazed. Like, I cannot believe there is a real baby that was just pulled out of me. And when they pulled her out, I felt so light, and I just felt like this huge release of pressure. That was an incredible feeling. And I just remember looking at her, and they did the delayed cord clamping, not as long as I would have liked. But they did give me that. They brought her over and they rubbed her down, which I really didn't want. But it's an operating room, whatever. They give her to me and I'm holding her. Oh, that was a beautiful moment. And I watched Brandon. He was very upset about the transfer also. And I haven't really shared a whole lot about that, but I think he actually took it a lot harder than I did. And I didn't know this because when they handed him the baby and he's standing there he's walking very slowly. And from my perspective, I thought, oh, that's really sweet and cute. He is, scared to walk with the baby, but that was not what was happening. What I didn't know was Brandon has had a secret desire of his own for the birth. He's talked the whole time about wanting to catch the baby. He wanted to be the first person to hold the baby. And he said what he was doing in that moment was actually dedicating her to God. And he said that it was a secret desire of his own heart to be able to have a moment with just her and with the Lord where he could pray over her and commit her life to the Lord. And I didn't know that. And he said that it was something God gave him where he just had a moment with her by himself before anyone else got to hold her and before I got to hold her or anyone. And he was able to bless her in that way. And that touched my heart. And for God to give Brandon that is very special. And he brought her over, and then I got to hold her and have her on me, and they sewed me up, and that seemed to take a long time also. It felt like a long time. And that's where I started to get kind of impatient. I was like, all right, like, come on, I'm done with this surgery. Let's get out of here. Like, come on, everyone. And then whenever they went to put me back on my bed, that was also really cool because they have this mat that they were able to like blow up and then transfer me, and that was just incredible because I couldn't move. And I loved that thing. I was like, oh my gosh, let's do that another 10 times. The blowing up, and it was just fun. Um, so they get me on my bed, they wheel me back. The midwives are in there. They are celebrating with us. And they told me that the whole time I was in surgery, they were praying and crying and interceding for me and just kind of grieving the loss of like what I had hoped for in my birth on my behalf. And that empathy and that love really, really meant a lot to me. And knowing that they had been there praying, and they stayed there the whole time. By this point, we are entering into our 4th day of labor. And I guess by this point it's post-labor, but we're going on 4 days that these girls have been up and with me and beside me. So they stick around for a while. They help me breastfeed. They help me like learn to latch. And that was an incredible experience. I just remember being like, oh, I can't believe what this is like. It felt amazing. Like I was just amazed. She took to it right away. And then I was exhausted, and because I couldn't move my legs, they like positioned me how I wanted my pillows and how I liked everything, and that meant the world to me. And then they left, and the last thing I'll say about this part, we're going to do a part 4 about the hospital experience, but the last thing I'll say about this part was my midwives went, after visiting and kind of making sure we were okay for a couple hours, they went to my house to visit with my dogs, and they brought my dogs the baby's hat, and they brought my dogs like a blanket or something to let her smell the baby. They made sure that the dogs had everything that they needed. They came and like did our dishes. They wiped the kitchen counters down, and that was also incredible. And keep in mind for them, it's like 4 and 5 a.m. They sent me some photos from their time here at the house together. And that was really special to me because I just think, all right, in the hospital setting, when you have an OBGYN, they deliver the baby and then it's see ya for the next checkup. Like, we'll see you in a day or so. Or in my case, I got my C-section. I saw the doctor the next day. So for my midwives really took a personal approach to my care. They went the extra mile. They went the extra 20 miles, in my opinion. And that to me is why I believe in this home birth stuff and why I would do it again. And I'm going to make a 5th video about why I would do it again and all of that. But for them to come back and care for our pets and clean our house and, just make sure that like they redid our sheets on the bed. They made the bed. So when we got home from the hospital, the bed was made, and there were things like that were done. They did a load of laundry, all in the middle of the night after 4 days of labor. So, what does that say about them? I think it's incredible and such a gift.